Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What we're going to talk about tonight is just a broad summary comparison of atheistic materialism and theistic hylomorphism. Big word, but what we're talking about is the Aristotelian Thomistic notion of matter and form explaining the universe. But at any rate, that's secondary. What I'm going to do at the outset is try to present the position of the atheistic materialist. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's too easy just to present one's view and not fully understand the opposition. If you really want to respond to atheistic materialism, you had better give it an honest presentation. And that's what I'm going to try to do here, to the best of my ability. The worldview from that of the atheistic materialist, first of all, is one that is very closely tied to natural science. And certainly those who call themselves atheistic materialists or scientific materialists are quite convinced that natural science provides all the truth that there is that's worth having in this world. So let's take a look at the way that they look at the world. First of all, we live in a cosmos which they, as well as most other people, would allow was the result of the so-called Big Bang, which took place, according to standard measurements, 13.8 billion years ago. It seems to be that was a beginning in time, because even Stephen Hawking, I was reading a paper by him, although I couldn't find the date on it, did allow that the second law of thermodynamics really indicates that there had to be a beginning in time. Because according to that principle, which is one of the most basic principles of physics, disorder increases with time. So that if the universe went backwards in time infinitely, by now there would be no order left at all, and we'd be just reduced to the level of protoprotons doing nothing, at near absolute zero. Since we're not, the universe, by most standard physics, would have to allow to have had a beginning in time. Now, you'll often see arguments, especially between evolutionary materialists and young earth creationists, about whether the world had a beginning. And the materialists, for the longest time maintained that there wasn't a beginning. It was just a steady state theory. It was here forever. And that's because they attest to what everybody should know by natural reason, and that is that if at any one time there was absolutely nothing in existence, there'd be nothing now. So it's a bit of an embarrassment, and they resisted for a long time the notion that of the Big Bang, that there was any beginning at all. And as a matter of fact, as you may know, some of the writings of some of the materialists, like Stephen Hawking, try to argue that even before the beginning of the Big Bang, that this was simply a little cosmic bubble coming off a previous Big Bang. And they suggest, and I'm going to present it from their perspective, that this goes back to infinity, so that you have, as it were, endless Big Bangs. They insist, of course, that this is not created by God, that the universe is simply a brute given fact. If you ask, why does anything exist at all? The answer they would basically give you is, it exists because it's a given that it does exist. And there is no reason why it should have to exist any more than that your God exists. If one is given as a brute fact, why not the other? And besides that, you can get something from nothing. As Hawking and others have suggested, you can get it using quantum mechanics from the basic quantum flux, where down at the very acute subatomic level, you actually have little bits of material entities popping into existence and then popping out of existence with no causality involved whatever. If you ask, why does anything exist at all? Many of the modern atheists will simply say that the universe has what they call aseity. aseity, meaning it exists of itself. It doesn't need a further explanation. I'm thinking of people like Roy Wood Sellers or Kai Nielsen or John Hospers and of course Hawking that insist that the universe is simply a given and it's not reasonable to ask why it is there. It doesn't need a further explanation. Now, to understand how they can say this, you have to realize that they would say what others, like the Aristotelian Thomistic philosophers, would say, well, there are metaphysical first principles, such as that effects have causes, and there have to be reasons for things. They would say, on the other hand, those principles are not universal. They are not transcendental. The causality that we experience in the world around us holds good for the world around us. But if you go down to the really sub-microscopic level, it doesn't have to be. Because at the sub-microscopic level, we actually find conflicts in the principle of non-contradiction. Standard metaphysicians say a thing has to be or not be, and can't have anything in between. But we have subatomic experiments which demonstrate that a photon can be at one time a photon, and another time it would be viewed as a wave. And I say at one and another time, I should be more precise, at the same time, just depending on how you look at it. So I've had physicists argue with me that, in fact, the principle of non-contradiction at the subatomic level doesn't apply. In other words, it's not a truly universal principle, and that's why when you come to explaining the entire universe, why does it have to apply there? We have simply assumed that it applies. They will admit that based on stochastics and probability, at the macroscopic level that you and I exist in, we will never see a violation of causality. But at the same time, that's because the statistics, as you might say, round everything off so that it works the way you would expect it to work. But at the theoretical level, when you're dealing with the principle of indeterminacy and you're dealing with the Copenhagen interpretation of what's taking place at the subatomic level, these rules are not absolute. Things are contingent, chance, fluctuating, uncertain. And if they are uncertain at that level, in principle, they could be uncertain even at the supramacroscopic level of the entire universe. So they would insist that the best evidence we have about the world comes from natural science, but you can't use the reasoning about causality in this world to argue to some kind of a transcendent world for which we have no evidence whatever. Chance and indeterminacy exist at the quantum level. It's where violation, like they say, it's curiouser than you could possibly imagine. And therefore, the common sense philosophies of the world around us simply betray us at that level. You can't really trust them to assist us. Now, beyond that, if you probably have heard about the anthropic principle, which points out that the laws of this universe are so perfectly adjusted that, for example, if the Big Bang had expanded 1/100,000th of a millionth times faster than it did, it would have just dissipated and the stars and suns and the planets would never even been formed. Or if it had been any slower in its rate of expansion, it never would have expanded, it would have collapsed in on itself. So to get the world that we're in, not only that rate of expansion had to be perfect, but a dozen other major constants had to be just so to get this world. And that's why many argue that that is evidence for some kind of intelligent design. Well, the problem from from the standpoint of the materialist, is that it's possible that what we have is multiple universes, and that what happens because of the principle of indeterminacy is like Schrodinger's cat. It's either alive or dead, but you don't know until it comes out. When you open the box, it's either alive or dead. But while it's in there, you don't know which way it's going to be. The universe is like that. It branches. Every time an event takes place, at the sub-microscopic level, we can't be sure what's going to happen. So it's one theory for multiverses is that the one universe goes one way and another one goes another way. So you're in one universe and your doppelganger's in another universe taking a different course of action. Anybody who's seen the Star Trek series has seen episodes based on this kind of theory. Well, as a matter of fact, the idea of multiple universes extends to probably at least 10 or 12 different theories of multiple universes. So we're not going to go through those tonight. But the argument that is being made is this. Because there are potentially infinite numbers of multiple universes, what we take to be the order and design and the fixed constants that are perfect for life and intelligent life in this universe just happens to be because we are in one of those universes that turned out right. There could be a nearly infinite number that turned out unsuitable for life, unsuitable for anything. But a few of them, like if you had 1,000,000 marbles in a bag and there were 5 blue marbles, if you shook it up enough times, the 5 blue marbles would come out next to each other. And that's what we're in. We just happen to be in one that looks intelligible and intelligent to us because that's the one we happen to be in. And if it weren't this kind of a universe, we wouldn't be here to know it, would we? So it doesn't really prove an intelligent designer. It just raises the possibility that we just got lucky. Pure chance, in other words, begets this cosmos. Nevertheless, it begets a cosmos in which the chemistry tends to beget conditions that give rise to life. And even though it seems, amazing that it would be such, remember, there's a countless number of other universes where it didn't happen, where it didn't work out. We're in one where it did. And because it did, life arose from the basic building blocks. The first stars were made of hydrogen. They convert to helium. Heavy metals are formed therefrom. From the second generation of stars then begin to produce planets that include heavy types of planets such as Earth, and with carbon and molybdenum and lead and strontium and nickel and all the other elements that are necessary as building blocks of life. You get that primordial soup, and out of it suddenly, given enough time, enough chance, plus the entropy that's within the chemical elements in this universe, not everyone, it gives rise to life. And thus, once you have self-replicating biochemistry, and we have today experiments that indicate at a very primitive level that with some amino acids and so forth, we can get self-replicating chemistry, but given enough time, we'll do it all the way. I mean, this is the argument that we are developing here. So the rules of this cosmos are such that they tend to give rise to life. When you begin to get living things, what you really have are simply associations of basic subatomic and atomic particles, entities, elements, compounds. If you stop and think about it, it isn't that they really give rise to, say, living organisms that are what we would call a unity, a unity of a thing. Because that's where the Aristotelians say, well, they've got to have forms. You got to have a form for a mushroom, and a form for a horse, and a form for a man. But you see, there really aren't any such forms. What you have is simply the pure chance production of biochemical unities, soups that are capable of nutrition, growth, and reproduction, entities that are bound together by certain accidental forces but enable them to work under the guidance of DNA, which again is spontaneously formed. This DNA then guides the way that they are able to operate in such a way that we take them to be a single living organism. But in truth, they are simply a highly complex set of organic compounds interacting according to an algorithm that was developed through 3.8 billion years of evolution on this Earth. And what looks as though it's designed and directed so as to give unity to these living things, in fact, is simply the result of pure chance interactions of the chemicals that are involved. And you can move this all, I don't even want to say all the way up through life forms, because, you know, life forms are not better than one another. This idea of, you know, getting more and more perfect life forms, that's a misunderstanding. The truth of the matter is that based on survival of the fittest, a moss is a wonderful life form. And the fact that it hasn't undergone all the changes that we see in the world around us for millions and billions of years is only an indication of what great survival value it already attained. As for the plants and the animals which give rise to more and more complex forms, you have to remember they just happen to branch off into certain forms that had enough survival value to stay around to the present time. Some of them did go extinct, like 65 million years ago when that asteroid wiped out all the dinosaurs. But what I'm trying to get across here is it isn't that one life form is superior to another, they're simply different. They're just different. And some of them, yes, develop capabilities like sensation. But you have to remember, that isn't because this is a new and qualitatively superior perfection. This is because it was built into the chemistry of the compounds that made them up. You don't get the quality manifested until a compound is formed. To put it in very simple terms, look at sodium and chlorine. You can't eat sodium and chlorine. They're deadly poisons. But if you combine them, they suddenly manifest this wonderful capability of being able to be put on your hamburger and it tastes better. Now, it isn't because we've added anything to the world, it's just that what was already implicitly within the sodium and within the chlorine is now manifested when they happen to be operating together. So that's how you have to look at all the changes that occur through evolution, through billions of years. The things that you think are new and better and more perfect really aren't. They are simply the manifestation of qualities that were implicit in the basic subatomic entities from the beginning and just get manifested because of the way they happen to mix together. So obviously what I'm attacking is some of the theistic notions that somehow God has ordained and designed this world and put into it more and more perfect things, ultimately leading to man. No, not at all. This is just a matter of what's implicit in the basic biochemistry from the very beginning and doesn't involve anything that's really new. It's just what was assumed or what was already entailed as properties waiting to be manifested when certain compounds got together in the right way. So what takes place is we have a gradual emergence by randomness and chance and natural selection. Even, now some people say, well, you materialists, you're looking at this from, you know, like you're dealing just with a bunch of marbles or BBs or something. No, many materialists would say, we even allow that there are immaterial things. The Marxists do this. They sure didn't believe in God, and they surely were thoroughgoing materialists, but they allow that there are immaterial things. They allow that, for example, an image, you won't find it inside a brain. If you're thinking about or imagining a brilliant Christmas tree, you won't find a little Christmas tree in your head. But we know that given the correct neuronal patterns within the brain, this kind of an experience takes place. So we allow that there may be non-material things formed, but they are ultimately dependent upon matter, and therefore you still didn't get beyond matter. You're still living in a materialist universe. And I realize, for example, that we do have the classical arguments like we find in Plato for man having a spiritual soul, because we go beyond merely what's dependent on matter. we're able to know the universal essences of beauty and truth and justice and all this sort of thing. We're able to form the understanding of the essences of all sorts of things that could not possibly depend on matter. Well, we have an answer to that one too, and it's called nominalism. What you take to be universal words are simply individual words that describe a group of things that happen to be similar to each other. And it's really the word standing as a symbol for those individual things. And if you know the literature, you realize it's hotly contested as to whether this can be explained by what I call the nominalist thesis. But basically that would be the explanation. It's just like a sheep knows a wolf and the wolf knows a sheep, not because they have some abstract notion of wolfiness or sheepiness, but because they have a common image that they have formed that is like other images that they get from different individual wolves. So the sheep learns to react from prior experience in a consistent way, running away whenever it runs into something that is similar to that common image. And the wolf conversely tries to eat the sheep for the same reason. So in essence, in other words, what you take to be cerebral or actually spiritual activities on the part of man that distinguishes him and makes him superior to animals is simply a highly evolved form of sensation, and sensation is reducible to neuronic activity in the brain, even though some of its epiphenomena are not themselves extended in space. And what you take to be the spiritual part of this really just doesn't get beyond that point. Clearly, in this worldview, we have, and we're able to explain everything. There's no universal essences, for example. Now, this whole idea that there are species and these universal essences can be used to explain all things, that's also misleading, because there really aren't any species. We know from evolution that all you have is individuals that are constantly changing. Even with the kind of saltistic evolution that Eldridge and I forget the other fellow's name, hold today, that it's kind of a sudden change, but even within that sudden change, it takes place gradually over a period of a few hundred years. But the point is, there is no such thing as just a cat. What a cat is just a name for a mid-range of similar furry, clawy creatures that we cast into biological species for purposes of discussing and handling them for veterinary medicine. So you don't really have the universals that the Platonists and the spiritualistic philosophers use as the basis for their claims for man having a special spiritual soul. In other words, or again, you talk about human freedom. We can explain that by the principle of indeterminacy. At the subatomic level, ultimately, the subatomic events are not predictable. They are not strictly causal. There is no way ever to determine them. And therefore, maybe what you call free will is just that. And if it isn't, then you really don't have free will, and you still have a deterministic universe, and you don't need a God for that. So I think that's a fair representation of the position that would be held by scientific materialists. This is only a summary position. Obviously, later on in our courses, we'll go through this in a greater detail from a number of points of view. But it's really important, if you're going to respond to or attack a position, try to get it as right as you can. Try to be as honest as you can in letting them present what they're saying, because we're not dealing with people that are unintelligent by any means.